So here's a list of the proposed JavaScript APIs for HTML5. And I'll give you a quick rundown of each one. The Contacts API is an API that will allow you to have a common contacts repository available within the browser that any application could access. So if you think of like your Google contacts or your contacts on Facebook, instead of them being loaded directly into those applications, they're stored in the browser and any app could access them. Unfortunately, right now, Contacts is very early on in its stage, not implemented in any one of the browsers. The Selection API is really brought to light by the wild success of jQuery. jQuery has many different uses and strengths, but at the core, it's its ability to select against the DOM. Now, as fast and as reliable and as good as jQuery is, you really can't beat having selections baked directly into the browser. And so that's what the Selection API now brings you. It gives you the opportunity to select items within the DOM in ways that you'd never be able to do before. So now it supports the CSS3 type of selectors in order to find items within the DOM. Now, just because it's more flexible for selection doesn't mean that the use of jQuery has gone away. In fact, not at all. In fact, you still need the jQuery API to do a number of common things, to do add and remove classes and go beyond what you need to do for selection. But as you'll see in some demos in later modules, the selection, it gives you much more flexibility of what's found directly within the browser. The next addition is offline applications. And so this gives you an opportunity to mark certain pages within your web application and say that it's basically like the browser cache, except much more reliable and much more stable. So you mark items within your application. You say that these pages can be available to the user if they're in offline mode. And then you can also mark certain items as being server only. So if you know of a resource that requires dynamic processing, you can say that this won't be cached. But there's a lot of flexibility found in offline applications. Next, I want to talk about the index database and the web SQL database at the same time. And let's talk about actually the web SQL database first. When I first saw some of the initial proof of concepts of local database storage within the browser, I saw the web SQL database. Now, as an application developer and someone who's used to seeing SQL query language and doing insert and update statements directly within JavaScript, this got me pretty excited because I was able to see how I could use my existing skills of working with databases and apply that directly to items within the browser. Unfortunately, Web SQL DB is dead on arrival. Although it's included in the HTML5 spec, at least up to this point, development has been halted for the Web SQL DB because the problem is that there's a dependency that's created upon the structured query language of whose SQL are you going to use. So there's a number of major browser vendors who've simply come out and said that they will not support the Web SQL DB. So instead of Web SQL DB, the answer to this question lies in the index database. And so this is a little more closer to the idea of like an object database rather than the typical relational database that you might think of. But it still gives you indexing and searching and filtering and sorting and all the stuff that you'd come to expect from a database application. As of late 2010, the index database is not implemented in any of the major browsers. But that's a feature that's in high demand and surely will be coming soon. Now, when you think of web workers, you can kind of think of like threading on the client. So often what happens is perhaps you might have some heavy number crunching, some sort of processor intensive type of calculation that you do on the client. Well, this can often hang the UI thread and make the page unresponsive to the users. So web workers give you a chance to delegate that calculation out to a web worker. It runs in the background, and then there's a messaging API that goes back and forth between the browser and the worker in order to communicate with the worker in the UI and allow it to be responsive for what's happening in the background. Now, when we talk about web storage, there's two different flavors of the web storage. There's session storage and there's local storage. So if you're familiar with server-side application development, the whole idea of having session storage is something that's not new. So as a user creates the session on your site and they go from page to page, you're able to persist information throughout these requests. And you now have the same ability to do that within the session storage on the browser. There's also local storage where you can persist information beyond requests. And so this is kind of like a cookie on steroids. There's a couple of significant differences between the storage API and cookies. Number one, the storage API gives you much more space available to you than what's found in the limited size found in cookies. And the other significant change is that cookies are transmitted from the client to the server upon every single request. And with the storage API, all of that information rests on the client, and you can access it anytime you want, but it's not sent from the client to the server. The WebSockets API gives you the opportunity to send socket information from the client to the server. So consider an application that you were building maybe that included instant messaging, or maybe like a Skype type of thing where you're sending packets of audio information in real time. You would use the WebSocket API for something like this. Server events is something that you may know by a little bit of a different name. When we first encountered Ajax, there was another design pattern that emerged, which was called Comment. And this is basically the reverse of Ajax. It gives you an opportunity to have a constant connection between the server and the client and allow you to push information up to the client. Well, the server events is the API that will allow you to do this in the future. XML HTTP request level 2, or again, our good friend Ajax. There's a lot of good to be found within the Ajax APIs currently found within the browsers. But there's one main difficulty that exists, and that is the whole idea of not being able to do cross-domain requests. Now, these rules are put up for good reason. If you have a page that's requested from server A, you don't really want to be able to post information to server B, or else you could expose a pretty huge security hole in your page. However, when you're building contemporary websites and you want to create a mashup, or perhaps you just have resources from different servers, there's a real world need in order to allow Ajax applications the opportunity to talk to different servers other than their origin. So XML HTTP request level 2 allows for this cross-domain posting, but it's done in a secure way. With the rise of popularity in mobile devices, the geolocation APIs are a great help, giving you the opportunity to locate not only the latitude and longitude of where the user is at, but also altitude and other things as far as the formal specification is concerned. I'll have some samples for you later on in this series of how to work with geolocation. I spoke of Canvas when I was telling you about the markup that was now available within HTML5. And the canvas for HTML5 is a 2D context. I guess this kind of hints to the fact that in the future we'll see a 3D context coming from Canvas, and there's some proof of concepts available out in the web for you to find. But within HTML5, you have the 2D canvas available to you. When we consider HTML microdata, if you think of information that's on your web pages, there's a lot of information that can be consumed by machines and also by humans. And often if we want to create a delineation between what's appropriate for a machine and a human, we create a web page for a human to read, and we create a web service or a REST service available for a machine. But how much better would it be if you could simply publish a web page and you could style it for what's appropriate to a user, but then you could add a little bit of extra information around that data, so that if a machine accessed that very same web page that was served to the user, it could extract out the information that it needs easily. Well, HTML microdata is the API that allows this type of interaction to happen. Later on, we'll have the ability to capture media. Maybe from a mobile device, we'll be able to access the camera or the webcam in order to build these types of applications directly within the browser. I talked a little bit about the messaging API, and this is kind of a support API that serves the APIs like the workers and other things within the browsers. The Forms API has been added to a lot, and many of the data types that we use commonly within Forms are now represented by first-class tags available within the Forms. So now instead of just putting a text box up on the page, if you need an email address, you can declare it as an email type, and the list goes on and on. And finally, the File API will give the browser the opportunity to access secure areas within the user's machine of talking directly to the file system. And so when you look at the landscape of the JavaScript APIs that are coming as a part of HTML5, you can see that truly rich application development will be enabled through HTML5.